I'd now like to introduce to you Ken Turino. We do have a change in program today. Although the topic will be the same, it is still the lecture Family Treasures. And Ken is the exhibitions manager for SPNEA, and he holds an MA from George Washington University. He's worked at the Paul Revere House, the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, and he was most recently the director of the Lynn Museum for over 14 years. And he's also adjunct faculty in the Tufts University Museum Studies program. And he serves on the board of the Bay State Historical League and the Victorian Society of America. Ken's very busy, the New England chapter. And Ken is the Massachusetts representative for the awards program of the American Association for State and Local History. So please help me welcome Ken Turino. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me back to the Old South. Today I want to talk with you and show you images about objects, cherished possessions. I want to talk to you a little bit about the collections of SPNEA, a little bit about SPNEA, and tell you what I think will be some quite interesting stories behind some of these objects. Now, objects, in my mind, serve to make the remote past concrete. They connect us to the life and times of the people who use them. Their meaning, while embedded in the objects themselves, also changes as they are separated from that culture and move through time. And I'm going to use two exhibitions to sort of illustrate the meaning of objects and how they change. Two actually quite very different exhibitions that SPNEA has put on. And I'm going to start with the slides now. I think, yes, here we go. Great. I hope that most of you at this point are familiar with SPNEA, the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. And to tell you that from its beginnings in 1910, William Summer Appleton, our founder, sought to collect not just the treasured possessions of people, but also the everyday objects. And I think you'll see that as we progress. This is the Harrison Gray Otis House. SPNEA is known as a preservation organization, one of the premier preservation organizations in the country. But it's much more than that. The Harrison Gray Otis House over on Cambridge Street, open year-round, also serves as our headquarters and our library archives, as well as a historic house museum. The library archives contain over 1 million documents. They include drawings, architectural plans, photographs, also account books and letters, family papers, and so on. It's an absolutely extraordinary collection going up to the present day. Now, as I mentioned, we are a preservation organization. That's just one part of our business. We own 35 historic properties all over New England. This is Beauport in Gloucester, and I hope that many of you have had the opportunity to visit some of these properties. This is truly one of the most magnificent, located on Gloucester Harbor. And I'm just going to go through these quickly to give you a taste of what we have in our portfolio of buildings. Hamilton House up in Maine, Codman House, which actually was the first house to come in SPNEA's collection in 1929 that brought the entire collection of family objects, photographs, manuscripts, and the property. And we made the commitment to document them as they were as a baseline for research and interpretation, and to make as few changes as possible. Also, the Bowen House in Connecticut. Besides the 35 historic properties, we also have a tremendous collection of landscape and gardens that we encourage the people to see. And a working farm. This is in Rhode Island. Actually, two working farms, Watson and Casey in Rhode Island. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, from the beginning, Appleton did not collect just the prized possessions of the pilgrims and patriots. Something like this, a mourning picture which dates from the early 19th century. And it was made by Anne Coombe as a poignant memorial to her mother, who died at the age of 36 in Anne's infancy. Now, I was talking about the meaning of objects. Clearly, this was a cherished possession that was passed down through the family because it documented, obviously, a very sad time. I should point out that the portraits of the little girl, the father, and her brother are actual portraits of the people. And these were probably done in Boston by John Johnston, a prolific artist. Now, these mourning pictures were, even in their day, highly prized, highly valuable. A lot of time and effort went into an object like this in terms of the girl doing the sewing, which was learned in a school in Boston, and then the framing, the painting, all made it a very, very expensive artifact, and one that was treasured. These pictures require accomplished needlework skills. They were time-consuming and, as I mentioned, expensive. Completing a picture like this could take from 6 weeks to 6 months. And it was really small wonder that they were held pride of place in a family home. They were a mark of a daughter's accomplishments and refinement, but they were also a symbol of the family's gentility, and they were also a mark of the father's ability to spend money. Now, as I mentioned, we don't collect just the treasured, the most prized objects, but we collect the everyday. And this was something that Appleton, our founder, was really ahead of the curve in doing. There were many collectors during this period, but again, they were looking for the most prized objects. And I will have to tell you a little story. I was in Tokyo a couple of years ago at the Tokyo Museum, a wonderful modern building dedicated to the history of Tokyo. And as we went through the exhibitions, they had a section on everyday life in Tokyo in the 19th century. And I was quite surprised, and probably shouldn't have been, to see that all the objects in that section were lent to the Tokyo Museum from the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, because they were the everyday objects. And those were the things that were not prized in Japan and were not collected in Japan and were basically used until they were worn out and then thrown away. What happened was that collectors from Boston, associated with the Fine Arts Museum, collected the fine arts painting in China for the MFA, but these everyday objects went to the then Peabody Museum, now the Peabody Essex. And the only way they could be illustrated in Tokyo was borrowing them from Salem, Massachusetts. I found that fascinating. So Appleton, again, was ahead of the curve in collecting everyday objects. And I talked to you about our properties, but we're much more than an organization made up of those 35 historic houses. We have over 100,000 objects in storage, which we bring out to the public through special exhibitions. And these are just some photographs of just some of the collections not associated with the historic houses. Just to give you a little taste of the variety. And I will only say that there are floors and floors of this material. And it is just a tremendous, tremendous collection. You can see the variety. And it just goes on. And again, some everyday objects, the lighting equipment, and I just, I didn't notice this. I have to point this out. The Christmas lights here, and actually the Chinese figures came from my childhood when I grew up in Stoneham, Massachusetts, and they were accepted into the collection. Toys from all different periods here. And this collection of boxes spans a history of 200 years. I want you, I'm not doing this just as PR, but the lunchbox there has a special meaning for me because it was my lunchbox as a child. And we did an exhibition of boxes, and that made its way into that exhibition. And it's really through these exhibitions that we get these objects out to the public. This was an exhibition called From Dairy to Doorstep, which you can see next year at the New Hampshire Historical Society if you haven't seen it at the National Heritage Museum in Lexington. But as part of this, does this look familiar to anyone? Yeah. Can you guess what date of this is? This is from? What? Late 40s, early 50s. That's absolutely right. And this is one thing that museums can really do in putting these objects together in settings how they may have been found and using illustrations like the backdrop, which is from a magazine, to help flesh that out. Historian Stephen Mintz writes that objects presented in museums illustrate and render vivid historical abstractions. Objects offer vivid and detailed records of history, of the look, of the clothing, the atmosphere, and the physical environment of past eras in a way that no written account can. And I have to tell you, when we presented this exhibition, this was the most popular part of the exhibition because so many people could remember this from either their childhoods or from their living through that. I remember this not from really my childhood, but, my grandmother's house didn't change. It looked like this for a long time. So this is one thing that we at museums can do in terms of presenting objects. Now, I want to talk about an exhibition called Cherished Possessions, which details the stories of roughly 175 objects reflecting a history in New England that is varied as the region itself. And I'm showing you a copy of the catalog, which we have available at the Otis House. And these stories help explain why things were valued in their own time and why they have been preserved both within families and within the museum. Now, I want to start out with one of the earliest objects, this cradle. Now, if we were in a museum, I would have another cradle next to this and ask you to make just some comparisons. But I want you to look at this really very carefully. And just by looking at it and knowing what you already know from studying history and all, is there anything that strikes you about this cradle? Anything unusual? Thank you. This cradle is very ornate. Most of the cradles from this period, the 17th century, were very, very simple. And this cradle belonged to John Thatcher in the 17th century. It dates from 1639, his dates, to 1713. He was a prominent citizen of Yarmouth, Massachusetts on Cape Cod. He was of high rank, but not the highest rank. And we don't know exactly why or how he had this piece, because it's an extraordinary piece. And it may be that it was the Thatcher's family's particular personal history that merited an elaborate cradle. And I want to tell you that story. Thatcher was born out of tragedy. In August 1635, soon after his family arrived in the New World, his parents and their 4 oldest children, along with their cousins, set sail from Ipswich to Marblehead around Cape Ann. They sailed into a hurricane. The ship foundered, and all aboard except Thatcher's parents were drowned. So his older brothers and sisters were all killed. His parents had 2 more children, but the loss of the 4 oldest must have weighed heavily on them. And perhaps in a family that knew such loss, even in the next generation, the birth of a child had special meaning, hence the care with which this cradle was made. And over the course of time, the stories sometimes change. This is what happens with objects. There was a written account about this cradle that said that it washed ashore with the youngest child in it. But we know from a letter that survives by Thatcher's father to his brother, just days after the event, he describes rescuing his wife's petticoat and his own flint and powder horn, but no mention of the cradle. So we don't know exactly why his family had such an elaborate cradle. What we do know is that, in any case, its survival over 300 years suggests the place of honor the cradle held for subsequent generations of the Thatcher family. And the cradle resides in the Winslow Crocker House down in Yarmouth on the Cape. Now, this six-board chest, as it's called, because that's basically what it is, 6 boards nailed together, is what one historian has called an eyewitness object. It dates from 1699, and we know that because the date, which unfortunately you can't see in the slide, is carved into the center, along with the initials that stand for John Sheldon of Deerfield, Massachusetts. Now, in 1699, Sheldon was just completing the building of his ambitious 2-story home. Within 5 years, on the wintry night in late 1794, the chest was a silent witness to the bloody slaughter that took place in Deerfield and left 3/5 of the town's residents dead or captive. Deerfield was on the edge of the frontier in 17th century New England. The threat of Indian attack was constant. And to protect the citizens, a large fencing garrison was built. Between 1675 and the final skirmish that took place during the French and Indian Wars in 1746, Deerfield was attacked some 30 times. But this witnessed the bloodiest attack. On February 28th, while the residents were asleep, the attackers waited outside town. They creeped past the houses outside of the palisade and approached the garrison quietly. Deep snow surrounded the protective fence, which made it easy to climb over. 40 of the soldiers scaled the fence and opened the gates for the rest to enter. The Indian and French soldiers broke into small groups, attacking individual houses within the fort, breaking doors and windows. Before the night's end, 56 English men, women, and children were killed, and 109 were taken captive, and nearly half the town burns. The attackers also had about 50 of their people killed. John Sheldon's newly built house witnessed the initial attempts the attackers made to enter. Instead of what they did is they used a hatchet and made a gash in the front door, and then, using that gash, fired a rifle through the gash. One bullet hit Sheldon's wife in the neck and killed her. They then broke in the house, and one child was killed, and the others were taken captive. Sheldon survived, as did his newly married son, whose wife was captive, his son running to get help. The captives were marched north to Canada. Those who could not keep up were killed. Sheldon was at the center of the efforts to bring these people back and went to Canada and secured their release over a period of time. After that, he moved to Connecticut, but his son remained living in the house. Finally, he moved, his son, John III, moved into another house around 1735, presumably taking the inherited furniture with him. And it was in this house, under the attic eaves, more than 200 years later, that this 6-board chest was found. In an article documenting the chest, one of these descendants wrote, "May its future be free from both the violence of its youth and the obscurity of its middle age." And this is one of the great strengths of SPNEA collections, that the artifacts and the stories that I'm telling you are extremely well documented. And you will see that for many of these we have photographs. We actually have a photograph of the house that this belonged in. We have photographs of the family, and we have written documentation. So that makes its collection, our collection, particularly valuable. Now, these are definitely luxury items. These wax figures rank among SPNEA's greatest treasures. They are the only known surviving American-made 18th century freestanding wax figures. They survive with their original stands and fragile glass bells. They came to SPNEA through the family of actually the Gardner and G families when Sarah Gardner became the Reverend Joshua G's third wife in 1740. She brought with her furniture, bedding, silver, and 3 shadow glasses on stools filled with waxworks. These waxworks were taught in the same schools where the embroidery was taught. The morning picture I showed you was also from one of those schools. These figures themselves must have been extremely rare in their day because these are the only surviving ones. And that makes them particularly important. The third figure seems to have disappeared, and they were donated in 1924 by the maker's great-great-granddaughter. And here's the second one. Extraordinary figures. Now, have you all, I don't know about you, but I've thought about this. Have you ever thought about if your house or your apartment was on fire, what would you save? Have people thought about that? I see a couple of people nodding their heads. Okay, I'm not the only morbid person here. Well, this chest, which belonged to Colonel Josiah Quincy of Boston, is a remarkable survival because it was saved from a house fire not once but twice before 1770. Quincy was a well-to-do merchant who became rich as a privateer, which was basically legalized piracy. His family became particularly prosperous and one of the leading Boston elite families. This allowed him to afford a very expensive piece in its day. There are only 3 dozen of these that survive from the 18th century. This one dates from 1735 to 1745. And what happened was he moved to Braintree from Boston, bringing this chest with him. In 1759, it was consumed by flames. Somehow this piece, along with others, was saved, and they were moved to another family property nearby. 10 years later, in 1769, fire destroyed the second house as well. Again, the chest was saved. Quincy wrote in his account book, "The greatest part of my furniture was by the timely assistance of our friends and neighbors secured from the devouring flames." Now, in his inventory, when he died, this was listed as being in one of the best bed chambers. But by that point, it was already 50 years old and really out of style. It descended through his family, and his great-great-granddaughter, Eliza Susan Quincy, wrote the history on a piece of paper and applied it to one of the drawers. So we know, again, the story. And it is, as I said, one of our greatest treasures. It's usually housed in the Quincy House in Quincy, Massachusetts. And it has been treasured by the family and by SPNA for more than 250 years. When new, it represented the height of fashion and linked its owner to the well-to-do in Boston and England. After an unlikely rescue from 2 disastrous fires, it came to be viewed as an emblem of triumphant familial past. Today, it is highly regarded both for its rarity and for its richly documented history. This is actually one of my favorite pieces. It's a teapot that belonged to James Buffum of Lynn, Massachusetts, a Quaker. This dates from 1835 to 1845, and it has the image it's the insignia of the English Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. It usually comes with an inscription, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This represents a whole line of ceramics that was made in England for the American market, specifically for abolitionists, and it was sold at abolition fairs and so on. Now, Quakers like Buffum were among the earliest people that were against slavery, and he befriended both the Hutchinson family singers and Frederick Douglass. Now, Lynn in the early 19th century was a hotbed for abolitionists. You had people like Douglass and the Hutchinson's family singers. They were the leading singing group in 19th century America, and they were based in Lynn. and they had people like Buffum and Hutchinson to their house regularly. They toured America singing about temperance and abolitionism. They actually wrote a song about Frederick Douglass. Now, Douglass was a runaway slave, and he escaped north from his master in Maryland, and first went to New Bedford, working on the docks, then got taken up into the abolitionist movement, went to Nantucket, was asked to speak about his experience as a runaway slave, and through that was brought into the movement and became a speaker for the whole movement. And with that, he wrote his autobiography and published it in Lynn in 1845. Now, he signed it with his name, his real name. He used his master's real name, and he also signed it Lynn, Mass., 1845. Well, he was a runaway slave. There was the fugitive slave law. His master now knew where he was and was prepared to insist that he be brought back into slavery and brought back to Maryland. Well, Buffum, with Douglass, essentially fled to England. And there, the Hutchinson family singers were performing. They actually performed for Queen Victoria and toured the country. They connected up with their friends from Lynn. Both Buffum and Douglass spoke regularly in England and stayed for well over a year. That service that I showed you at the beginning, well, what happened is first Buffum comes back and after a year, and Douglass remained in England until 1847. And it was probably at Boston, one of the Boston abolitionists, Boston anti-slavery fairs, I should say, that Buffum purchased that tea set. So it's a very, I think, very interesting stories that, as you heard, I have connections with Lynn. I appreciate very much. Now, this is one of the oldest pieces in our collection, and I want to go in now to a group of objects that were a bequest of Susan Norton that are just really extraordinary. This bowl dates from the 1573 to 1619. Its early history is unknown, and it probably came to Europe through Portuguese traders. But its significance, it really lies in the 19th century, because the bowl represents many of the principles of that century's arts and crafts movement and is a link between two of the movement's major proponents. In the middle of the 19th century, the English reformer John Ruskin, one of the founders of the arts and crafts movement, promoted the belief that in an age of industrialization, the waning reliance on hand craftsmanship could be directly linked to the increasing moral decay that was everywhere apparent. Now, his writings sparked debate. This bowl was given to Charles Eliot Norton by Ruskin. Now, Charles Eliot Norton was recognized as one of the leading minds of his generation. Through his courses at Harvard, he introduced the discipline of art history to this country and fostered humanities-based studies and Western civilization. Now, during a visit to England in 1855, Norton sought out reformer and critic John Ruskin, and the two became colleagues and friends. And before long, Norton was deeply influenced by Ruskin, and he became one of the leading proponents of arts and crafts principles in America. On both sides of the Atlantic, reformers believed that the study of handcrafted objects revealed deeply held truths about past societies. That's something I still believe in. This led them to collect many objects from the past, produced locally or from the Middle and Far East, like this piece. The bowl was a typical example. Now, this bowl, a gift from Ruskin to Norton, was used for the baptism of his granddaughter, Susan, which took place in Rome in 1902. And Susan was the person I mentioned who donated this piece, as well as this piece of her aunt, Sarah Norton, done by another leader of the, well, not really arts and crafts movement, but aligned with that, and that is the artist Edward Burne-Jones. This painting done in 1884 is a fine example of the pre-Raphaelite art that was being done in that period. Sarah Norton accompanied her father to Europe on several trips. And it was when the family visited Germany that Sarah, age 7, was given violin lessons. That trip ended tragically when her mother died, and Susan, being the oldest, really, along with her aunts, took care of her younger siblings. And that was a role that she would retain for quite a while. In the summer of 1884, Sarah, 19, accompanied her father to England, where he was to receive an honorary degree in Cambridge University. The two spent time in London with his close friends, artist Edward Burne-Jones and his wife, Georgiana. Now, Burne-Jones did not typically do portraits, only a few, but this one is inscribed EBJ to CEN, apparently a gift from Norton to the artist. There's actually a photograph of Burne-Jones's house that has a copy of this, a photograph of it, on his mantle. So it must have shown that he felt very close to this portrait, even though he had given it away. The pre-Raphaelites looked to medieval sources for inspiration and emphasized color and decorative quality in their paintings. And proponents like Burne-Jones and Morris blurred traditional boundaries between arts and crafts, that's where we get in the Ruskin, by bringing it to bear the same attention to furniture, stained glass, and textiles that they did to paintings, poetry, and music. Now, I think you saw this, or I hope you did. You were observant in the photograph that I showed you just a minute ago. This was belonged to Susan Norton, 1902 to 1989, and this was unquestionably one of her cherished possessions, her favorite objects, her teddy bear. Now, the history of teddy bears is legendary. Do people know the story of how the teddy bear came to be? It's associated with Teddy Roosevelt. Absolutely right. He traveled south to settle a border dispute between Mississippi and Louisiana. During a hunting party, no bears were taken, but some of the party brought Roosevelt a bear cub to shoot. And Roosevelt refused. The story was memorialized in the Washington Star, and the cartoon showed Roosevelt holding his hand up in refusal with a scared-looking cub sitting in the background. Now, as the story goes, a Brooklyn store owner, Morris Mitchcomb, was inspired to make a stuffed bear cub for display in a store window. That bear sold right away, as did subsequent ones, and they kept selling as quickly as he could make them. He then wrote to the White House soliciting permission to call his toy Teddy's Bear. Permission was granted, and with a short time, his success with the teddy bear led him to found the Ideal Tour Company, later one of the nation's leading toy companies. Now, at the same time, these bears were being produced in Germany by the Steiff Company, and by 1907, they were producing close to 1 million bears a year. And other companies in England and America were scrambling to compete with their own bears. And as popular as the bear was in America, it was equally popular in Europe. In short, it was an international fad of unprecedented proportions. By World War I, the production began to decline. Unlike most fads, when this one faded, the teddy bear survived. Although never produced again in the numbers at the beginning of the century, it's still a staple in stores today. And here we have Susan with her teddy bear in Rome around 1902. And it's remarkable, having gone back and forth to Europe, that it remains in such pristine collection. So it just shows again what a cherished object it could be. Now, SPNEA does collect contemporary. This isn't quite contemporary. We'll get to some contemporary soon. But this is the Gropius House in Lincoln, Massachusetts, which is open all year. Gropius was the founder of the Bauhaus, and I want to show you some of his prized possessions. This is a chair designed by his co-worker at the Bauhaus, Marcel Breuer, And when Nazi Germany was rising, Gropius and Breuer both fled the country. Gropius first went to England, and it was here that he acquired Breuer's chair, subsequently bringing it to his house in Lincoln, Massachusetts. And he was a proponent of modern contemporary design, Gropius was. So the objects that you would find in his house reflected that. And this is the house in Lincoln. I want you just to notice some of the ceramics, but also these two butterfly chairs, which date from his trip to Tokyo in 1954. And he always was interested in design that reflected their belief in the marriage of design and industry. And that's why they acquired these pieces. Now, I have a few slides to show you from another very different exhibition called Yankee Remix, which is currently at the Mass MoCA Museum in North Adams, the largest contemporary art museum in America. And we worked with a group of 9 artists from all over the world and invited them into our collections. You saw some of these collections before, to pick out objects that spoke to them, to create new artworks. And it was fascinating to us that these artists were not drawn to the masterpieces, some of which I've shown you in the Cherished Possessions portion of my talk, but they were drawn to the everyday objects for the most part. And this is a piece created by Annette Messingay that deals with there are 4 vignettes. And these are farm implements, dressing forms. I have another photograph here that she chose. Now here, very simple cradles. A little bit later than the one I showed you, but you can see the difference between the very ornate one I showed you at the very beginning of this talk and these very, very plain and simple ones. Annette's piece was called Once Upon a Time and tells 4 stories that deal with home and family histories. This artist, originally from India, Reena Banerjee, looking at our collection to choose artifacts, it's interesting because the 2 of the artists chose things that were both in the Cherished Possessions exhibition and now in the Mass MoCA exhibition. These armchairs also were donated to SPNEA from Susan Norton, and they came from her grandfather, who I mentioned to you before, Charles Eliot Norton. He was working on a ship in the early part of his career when the main trade between the States and the world was with India and the Far East at that point. He was a supercargo responsible for overseeing the selling and buying of a ship's cargo in foreign ports. Traveled to India, stayed to explore it, and he was appalled by the British treatment of the Indian populace. But at the same time, he found Indians themselves to be called, quote, heathens. He bought this, which was popular in the mid-19th century and could be found in maritime towns around New England. So one of these chairs is in our Cherished Possessions exhibition because we know the well-documented history of how it descended in the family, how we came to it, and what it represented. But also, in Reena Banerjee's piece, which is called, I want to make sure I get you this title correct, Contagious Spaces, Preserving Pink Eye, 2003. She has 3 parts to that. One is an altar, and one is this. It's a recreation of the Taj Mahal, which is actually white, in pink saran wrap, showing the chair. And she's really concerned, as an Indian, a native Indian, about what does the East mean to the West? And what did India mean to England and to the United States a century ago? And how are these perceptions codified in SPNEA's collections? As I mentioned, we have the writings from Charles Eliot Norton, but also the Codman family visited India very early and brought back a picture book. And many of the letters that come with that are quite frankly racist. And she was really appalled at reading that. It was part of the time. You have to understand that. But at the same time, this object has a very different kind of meaning for her, because it represents the culture in India brought to America, but also brought with a lot of baggage, which made the Indians, quote, heathens or uncivilized. Here's another piece, another photo of that. And I'm going to tell you two other quick stories because I'm running out of time. This piece also appeared in both exhibitions. Now, to look at that, is it a very fancy piece, do you think? No, if you look carefully, it's kind of banged up. It's pewter, I should tell you, so it's not silver. And this piece, though, this gnarly old teapot, probably the least pretentious object in our Cherished Possessions exhibition, belonged to Crispus Attucks and has very deep associations. Not very far from here, he was the first man killed in the Boston Massacre of March 5th, 1770. Very little is known about Crispus Attucks. The Boston Massacre occurred after months with the Townshend and Stamp Acts brewing hostility between the colonists and the British. We do know that Attucks was a slave, and we do know that his father was probably black, his mother Indian, or at least we think that. And he was, according to John Adams, the one that rallied support to go down to the Customs House that night of March 5th. As I mentioned, he was the first person killed. Well, how did this survive, and where did it survive? Well, the family that at one time advertised for him as a runaway slave in the Boston papers, describing him as a mulatto fellow about 27 years old of age named Crispus, 6 feet tall, 2 inches high, short curled hair, his knees nearer together than common. It descended in their family with this history. And because he was the first person killed at the Boston Massacre, because he and others were immortalized in Paul Revere's engraving, which came out just weeks after the event. The colonists were great propagandists and got the word out. This piece, not fancy, survived all those years, descended in the Brown family, and eventually came to us. And again, deep associative history with that very humble object. Well, one artist, Frano Violich, from Boston actually, and an architect, chose that object to create another piece that evoked the man. Because as I mentioned to you earlier, we don't know a whole lot about Attucks. But we know his teapot, we know that he was put up as a hero later on. And Frano Violich tried to get back at who was this man, make us think about what was this man like. He created a video, cast molds of these teapots through a computer. It was scanned, a computer scanned the original teapot and made these plaster molds from it. Absolutely amazing. They're very, very delicate. And they're sitting on a bed of tea leaves. Again, going to the Boston Tea Party, the teapot, and the video includes images of a black man, obviously not Attucks, who's standing in and representing him, and grafted onto each of the teapots to represent each of the senses are an ear, an eye, a nose from this black man who was portrayed in the video. Very, very fascinating piece. Very thought-provoking, trying to get you to look at the objects through this newly created work and think about them. And I'm going to end with one of my favorite pieces done by this artist, and it's called For Which It Stands. Might sound familiar from the Pledge of Allegiance. This artist created, Zoe Leonard, 32 postcards that she went into the collections and photographed objects in the collection that resonated to her, that spoke to her. And she wanted us the public to look at these objects on the postcard, to think about, what does the Republic really stand for? What does it mean to be American? And is the U.S. really one nation under God with liberty and justice for all? And by looking at these images, I'll point out, get some detail. This is wallpaper showing cowboys and Indians, cowboys killing Indians. This was a child's wallpaper for a bed kit. We also have toy cowboys and Indians. She found many things that were actually racist in the collection, that were teaching children how to look down at others. This is a little folk painting in the collection. The child is holding an ABC book, and it's open. And it's open to C is for cat, and there's a picture of a cat, and D is for darky, and there's a picture of a black man. And she was very surprised to find some of these things, but they're of their period, and you have to remember that. So, again, the cowboys and Indians toys teaching us to kill, and something totally different, which can have very many, this is how objects change their meaning. And we were actually surprised that we found this in our collection. Some of you might remember seeing this, a Burger King crown. It points, in Zoe's words, to the democratic or anti-monarchy, against the monarchy, also, though, consumerism and the power of the U.S. corporate interest. Well, I have to say, for me, when I look at something like this, it's also a little bit nostalgia, because I remember it from my childhood. So objects can have, their meanings do change over time. As part of Zoe's piece, you can actually buy these postcards. There's a little vitrine right behind this woman, so you can put your 50 cents in and actually take them away with you. So once the postcard leaves, it's basically free of the museum, and it can mean whatever to whoever. Okay? In this case, meaning is in the individual who buys the postcard, and it will change as it changes hands. You may pick one of these images because it just strikes you as being funny, or it brings a memory back of your childhood. You mail it to someone else, they have another meaning when they pick it up out of their mailbox and look at it. The meaning of objects does change over time, and it can have a whole series of meanings through history. And us at museums, and when you go to visit them, you have to look very carefully at objects in their setting to try and figure out those layers of meaning. Oftentimes, there'll be a cherished possession, but sometimes there'll be a humble kitchen utensil that tells us a lot about the people that used them at that period. So with that, I've gone a few minutes over. I don't know if you have any questions, but if you do, I'd be glad to take them. Thank you for coming. I hope you'll think about these things when you see them. Anyone have any questions about any things I showed you? Yes. The question was, how was I describing Crispus Attucks? 27. This was an exact quote that describing him. It was the ad for him as a runaway slave. It said that he was 6 feet 2 inches tall. He had curly hair, and that his knees, basically that it was knock-kneed, is what it was saying. That was the ad. Also described what kind of clothing he was wearing as a runaway slave. So presumably, he was brought back to the Brown family, but we don't know that for sure. We do know he was here in Boston, and we do know that the family were the people that cherished that teapot. We also have a banged-up cup that goes with it, pewter cup. Anyone else? That owned him as a slave. Yes. So the cup and the teapot descended through the family that owned him as a slave. How do we get the stories? That's a great question. How do we get the stories that come with these objects? Well, it's a little bit of both. Do we research them? Do they come with the object? Well, I showed you that Japan high chest of drawers, and I mentioned that the family, and New Englanders are great at this, and I urge you all to do it too, but they wrote the history and actually pasted it down into the drawer. You can't ask for anything better than that. Oftentimes these will come with family papers, and we will know some of the history from that. We'll sometimes be fortunate to have the bill of sale for a piece of furniture, so we know who made it and how much they paid for it. Again, New Englanders are hoarders of this kind of material, and it's wonderful for the historian. But oftentimes it's not there. That's why I usually tell people with their family photos in pencil, write on the back who it is and date it and so on. Never in pen, in pencil, for future generations. Another question? Yes, yeah. Yes, over 175 of those stories are told in that Cherished Possessions catalog. And there's also a catalog for the Yankee Remix. Again, a very different way at looking at objects, but it makes you think. Last question. The objects, well, some of the objects do reside in the houses. Most of them are in the collection storage. The only thing at the moment that you can see is that Yankee Remix exhibition at Mass MoCA. That's the only place currently. The Cherished Possessions exhibition is traveling around the country for the next 5 years. We're hoping that in 5 years it comes back to New England. Mass MoCA is in North Adams, Massachusetts. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for coming.